The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, welcome everyone to the Exago Support Lab. Today's topic, we're going to be talking about upgrading Exago, and this is in conjunction with our new release that came out just towards the end of last month, our 17.1 release, and it's actually perfectly timed, so we're going to talk about it. It's available today for download, which you'll see, and of course we're going to actually walk through a upgrade process. We still have a few folks signing on though, so we're just going to give them about one more minute. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pause for just a moment and we'll reconvene at 11:02 and let everyone fully sign in. Okay, great. It looks like everyone is signed in or coming in just now. So to get started, hi, welcome. My name is Travis McGrath. I'm the Senior Manager of Client Services here at Exago. I'm going to be leading today's support lab, and we're, as mentioned, going to be diving into what the steps are to upgrade Exago from older installations, either older versions, or if you're upgrading an interim build. Just a few housekeeping things. We are recording this session, so you'll have access to it later on. We'll send out a link to that recording following the session. But of course, all of our support labs are available on our support site, which we'll be navigating to in just a moment. A couple other things. We're specifically talking about upgrading because of our 17.1 release, which just came out. And we're going to be doing our release webinar where we go through the new features that are available in the new release in our upcoming next week. And so if you keep an eye on your email, we will be sending out an email invitation to that this coming week. One other housekeeping thing is that we do have everyone on mute. So just to make sure you can hear me, if you go to the lower right-hand corner here and of the GoToWebinar, and you'll see a questions panel. If you could just type a Y or a yes in the questions, just to make sure I'm coming through loud and clear. Perfect, perfect. Lots of yeses coming in. At any point today, if you have any questions, you want more details, you want to see something again to the best of my ability here, we'll go through that. So feel free. My colleagues Nick and Alex are going to be monitoring that, and they'll jump in if a question is good for the whole group. They'll provide it as well. So we want this to be as active and interactive as possible. Great. So with that, seeing lots of questions, but mostly yeses, nothing off the bat. So we'll get started here. So what we're talking about today is upgrading Exago. And what I'm going to do is we're going to go through the steps in a PowerPoint, and then we're going to actually go through the steps and upgrade a demo application. So the steps to upgrading Exago are going to be pretty straightforward. So to get started with, of course, you have to download the installer. And while we're there, we're going to download and look at the updating guide. With every major release, we put out an updating guide that puts any notes on, new features that are enabled by default, configuration settings, any heads up about future feature deprecations or changes that you might need to make. With interim releases, of course, we also always put out a changelog so you know what's going into interim releases in terms of fixes or minor updates in any way. And then, of course, the other piece here is you may want to make some backups. And specifically, I'll talk about these as we go, but you may want to back up some configuration files or key reports. And as we go through the updating process, I'll show a couple of ways that we can mitigate some of the need for backups. Once we have the installer, the next piece here is to run the installer. And so, of course, we're going to update the web application in the Exago BI platform. If you're using the scheduling service, and most of our clients are, for either scheduling and emailing or for remote execution, you have to maintain the same version between the scheduler and the main web app. So we'll want to run the installer for both components. And then if you're using a REST or SOAP-based API, of course you'll want to update that as well. And so when we run the installer, I'll point out all three of these steps, and we'll do the first two in our case. Then, if you're installing Exago, as we'll talk about when we run the installer, we can install on top of an existing installation, or we can install in a new, fresh installation. If we are installing a new installation, we're going to want to copy configuration files, language files, and other files used for customization. And again, we'll show that in just a moment. And then the last step here for updating is to update the host application so that it knows to point to the new Exago installation. So if we're updating versions, we're going to update the host app in its web config or app settings file so that it calls to the correct version of Exago. And similarly, if we have any extensibility projects, if we're using server events or action events or folder management, all topics we've touched on in previous support labs, or we'll talk about in more depth in future support labs, we'll want to update those projects as well. And that's the last one there. Similarly, just our web config, we're going to want to update as mentioned. And that's really it. So the process is going to be pretty straightforward. So I want to pause there and just see if there are any questions. Okay, no questions coming in so far. So to show you an example, what I want to do is actually walk through the process of updating a demo application. Now, of course, because Exago is an embedded tool, our application resides within a host app, and because we are fully white labeled, we're not going to show a client of ours. So we have this fictitious company here, and we've built a little demo application around it. And I'm just going to log in. Helps if I get my password right here. I'm just going to log in and launch Exago so that what we can see, if I do a Control-Shift-V, is that we're on version 2016.3. So this was our previous version prior to our 17.1 release earlier this spring. And what I want to do is update this so that the next time I log in, I can refresh this page, and I want to be on 17.1. So to do that, the first thing, of course, I have to do is I have to go to our support site, and that's just support.exagoinc.com. Now, if you've come here to the support lab, you're very likely familiar with this. Particularly, if you look for our videos, this is where you can find those support labs. And in fact, this support lab is going to be right here under this link later on. But right now, what we care about is downloads. And now this download button may only appear if you log in, or if you're not logged in, it may prompt you to log in. But I have a login to it. So I've logged in here as myself, and when I run the, I open this guy up, I have the option to download any of our supported releases. So if you want the latest update to 16.3, which is release 7, or 16.2, you can do that. But what we want to do today is look at some of the new features. So we're going to look at 17.1, and I already have this downloaded on my desktop, so I'm not going to go through the process of downloading it, but you would just say, you'd read and accept the terms and conditions, and then download either the Windows or Linux installation. And then importantly, you can look at the release notes, but the other piece we're going to look here is the updating guide. And our updating guide is the critical article when updating between major versions, so say from 16.3 to 17.1 like we're doing. But we actually write our updating guide so that it can be used even if you're coming from a much older version, say from 14.1, 15.1, etc. Yeah, so a great question just came in, which was, in our example, we're going to be updating from 16.3, but you may be updating, say, from 16.1, 16.2, 15.1, and you can go directly from a much older version to our latest version. And in doing so, the updating guide will walk you through all the steps that compound from, all the considerations from the versions in between. So you won't miss anything. There won't be sort of a heads up on a new feature that came in 16.1 and it won't be in that documentation. It'll be here in one of these previous articles. So I could quickly look through this. Now, I personally know what's in here, so I'm not going to spend too much time, but certainly when you update, I recommend you read it in full. But I noticed that there are a few language changes. I am not doing too much in terms of customizing the language of Exago, so I'm not worried about that. As well as some changes to the home page. That may take effect, but we'll be okay here for the demonstration. As well as some folder management questions. Again, in this case, we've already done some work on updating, so that won't be part of this demonstration, but we'll be talking about folder management in a future lab. And then the last thing I'll notice is here we have a new feature, the top end filters, and this is enabled by default. If I wanted to, I could disable this in the admin console, no problem. But the important thing is I don't see any major things that are going to take extra work, so I'm going to follow my normal updating process. Now, to begin with, I'm going to go to my desktop where I have my installer, and the first thing I want to consider is where do I want Exago to reside. So I have a folder under Program Files called Exago, and I keep a different installation of Exago BI for each major version of our application. So I have 16.3 being here for through our updating process. I have many older builds, but the important part is I want it to live in 17.1. Now, you don't have to create this folder ahead of time, but having run through this already with our initial release, I have the folder for me. Not going to be a problem there. But what we're going to do is we're going to run our installer as administrator, so I can just right-click here and run as admin. And our installer has 3 components. Now on that PowerPoint we talked about having to update the web app and the scheduling service. And if we're using either of the SOAP or the REST-based web service APIs, we'd have to update the API. But as is, we're just going to do the top 2 here. So I'm going to start with the web application. And I'm going to go in and specify what I want the virtual directory to be. And I like to use the naming structure we have here where we say either eWebReports or Exago _v and then the version 2017.1. And of course I want that to live in the corresponding folder, so I'll just say 2017.1. I look at it, I see that I didn't make any typos there, and I can say next, and this is going to start the installation. So a question came in and said, hey, well, what's new in the 2017.1 version? So there are some new features in there. I don't want to go into too much detail on them as these files load and the installer runs. I will just briefly mention that there's some really exciting new features around our Express views, both in terms of formatting, exporting, and in the ability to add charts and visualizations in as little as just one click. It's got a great new UI. We also have some cool technical features around caching and metrics capturing. So if you're interested in hearing those details in full detail, our webinar next week, we're going to be going into lots of questions and answers and a full demonstration of those. And that'll be next Wednesday, so almost exactly same time next week. So here it's just setting up our virtual directory and it finishes installing. So that's our main application. Now the web app, I'm not going to worry about the web service because our application, our demo app here is using our .NET API, but if I were using the REST or SOAP-based version of our web service, I would update that as well. But I am using our scheduler for emailing, so I'm going to update our scheduler. I did that here just by clicking the third button at the bottom. And in here, of course, I want to make sure I update the right schedule. Again, I have a few different scheduler services on my machine. And I'm going to say OK, and I'm going to run the installer for our scheduling service, which will stop the service, update it, and then restart. Great, and the scheduler, pretty small instance here, so no problems. And that's all I need to do here with our installer. So going back to our installation, our guide here, so that's downloading the installer. We read the updating guide, and the next thing we did was we ran the installer. So the third piece here, what we want to do is we want to copy any configuration. So looking at Exago, we have in here in our 16.3, we have some custom features in our application, our custom config files that were built by the admin console. And specifically, I want to take this one called demo config, and I want to move it over to our 17.1 folder. So here, if I go to 17.1, I want to move it over. Now, again, because I'm not starting here from scratch, it's already in place, so I'll just leave it there. But if I wanted to, I would, I'd just copy this over, and you can copy over either the plain text or the encrypted version. And similarly, if I have any custom language files, and in this case I do, I have one called enus extensibility. I want to copy this language file over. And importantly, I want to copy it not only to the config languages file folder in the web application, but I also want to make sure that that gets into my scheduler. Inside the scheduler installation, I notice there's a languages folder, and I want to make sure this file gets copied from my 16.3 installation to my 17.1 installation. So that's going to be my config and languages files. Now the other thing I might want to do is change our app themes. And so our app themes let us do custom styling where we can change the icons and CSS of the application. So in here, I want to make sure to copy the app themes from my 16.3 installation. And again, since I ran through this previously in updating, it's already here. But within this, I may have made some custom CSS changes. And I want to make sure those changes actually are up to date with any CSS in our 2017 version. So I could do this in a couple of ways. One, I could copy that basic app theme, and I could see the difference and make changes here. But in my case, what we can do here is we actually have a script in our host application that will build the app theme for us dynamically and make sure it's up to date with our 2017 version. Now, I'll show you what the impact of that is on some of the icons, and that's a script that we have and we can pretty readily share if you're interested. So that's going to take care of our config files and our language files. And really one key from our support team is making sure the language files get over to the scheduling service. I know that's one that comes up from time to time and is an easy thing to forget there. We're going to update our app theme, and then, as I mentioned, in our case, our host application is going to update the CSS inside that app theme so that it's on our 17.1 CSS. And we may want to make some changes to any custom ASPX or images. And in our example here, in our config file, we have some images, and we have a few custom ones for some extensibility features. We just want to make sure those make it over to the same place in 17.1 as well. So I want to take a moment there and just ask if there are any questions. Okay, let's see here. So somebody has their hand up with a question. Okay, so there are a couple of questions on Express Views and app themes. I think my colleagues Alex and Nick will give responses to those, written responses, and then those are actually great questions for next week's webinar where we go into detail on the 17.1 features. Okay, so with that in mind, let's go to our last two steps here for upgrading Exago, which is going to be that we need to update the references to the DLL for our host application and our extensibility project. And what I mean by that is our host app here is a .NET application. This applies, of course, if you're in the .NET API, but will be slightly different if you're using either our SOAP or our REST web service. But what our host app here does, and I can pull up our source code for it, is two things we're going to have to change. One is it has a reference to a DLL, so in our references, all the way up here, we have a DLL called Web Reports API DLL, and this is what we use from the API to launch Exago. And what we'll notice is this is a versioned DLL. So what we're going to want to do is tell it not to use the 16.3 version, but instead we can add a reference, and then we can find the 17.1 version. So if I were to browse, I would go to the path where I installed, and inside the bin directory, I'd find the DLL Web Reports API DLL, and I'd click OK. So that will let my .NET API from the host application know to use this new DLL in this new version. And then I want to do the same thing on my extensibility project, and the extensibility project is what allows you to do things like folder management, action events, etc. And again, I just want to make sure that all the DLLs are on the same version. So here we can run to our 17.1 version. And you'll notice that the DLL, when I deleted that reference, had some issues. But as soon as I add the reference to the 17.1 version back in, it will work here. And in that case, I'm going to rebuild both these applications. And to do that, I'm just going to refresh IIS here for a moment. There we are. And I'm going to do the same thing here. We had a rebuild just to make sure it's fully up to speed. Perfect. So coming back to our PowerPoint, that's going to tell the code itself to use the latest version of the Exago DLL. And then, of course, we have to tell the extensibility and host application to point to the new version of Exago. So again, going back to our host application, in our web.config file, we want to say that the app to the virtual directory and the path to Exago are to 17.1 and not 16.3. And in my case, I like to keep my temp files in different places, so I'm going to have our 17.1 temp path as well. And then for the very last change, we're going to have to go to our 17.1 installation and our 16.3 installation. And in our web config, because of the way we've set up our extensibility, we're just going to want to take this connection string here and move it over to the web config inside Exago of our 17.1 installation. And we're doing that specifically about how we set up folder management. And we're going to be covering folder management in a future webinar release, support lab. And so here, if we come back to the demo application and we give it a quick refresh here, and we go to log in, and I'll log in again as user 3. When I log in now and launch the reporting, we'll see that we're in our 17.1 release, our updated UI, with our new Express View capabilities. I'll just give you a quick sneak peek here. And we'll just build in 2 easy drag and drops and 2 additional clicks. We'll build a chart. So as a quick teaser for our release webinar coming up next week, and you'll see an email invitation to that webinar next week. I'll leave you here. Those were our steps for updating. Running through them very briefly, we upgrade Exago. We download the installer, look at the changelog and updating guide for any key notes. We run the installer for the web app as well as any scheduler services, and our clients using REST and SOAP-based web services also update that component. We carry over any config files, language files, or custom styling files that we used in integrating Exago. And then we update the host application, both its DLL and its web config, so that it knows which installation of Exago to point to. Those are the key steps to updating Exago, and we're really excited about the new features in our 17.1 webinar. So thank you again for attending. We'll stick around for just a few moments in any questions, but at this point we'll stop the recording, and this will be available on our support site shortly, and we'll send that out in a link to you.